The story begins far away from any known star, in a quiet corner of the galaxy where almost no ships travel. Out there, silence usually means safety. But on this particular day, silence only made the strange signal feel even more unsettling. It began as a soft pulse drifting through space. A repeating pattern that looked like a cry for help, but carried something. Extra something no one could explain. On a research vessel of a gentle alien species known for studying cosmic waves, the crew stared at the signal with growing confusion. At first, they thought their equipment was malfunctioning. The pattern was too irregular, yet too deliberate to be random noise. It seemed like two messages were mixed together. One was clearly a distress call, but the other layer felt older and deeper, as if it belonged to something far more powerful than any ordinary traveler. The crew spoke quietly among themselves, each person throwing out theories. One thought it might be a lost transport ship. Another believed it might be an echo from some ancient beacon waking up after centuries of sleep. A few were nervous from the moment they saw it, because the extra frequency did not match any known species. It hummed like something alive, something aware. Still, they decided to follow the signal. It was part of their mission to investigate unusual transmissions, and their culture believed strongly in offering help when someone needed it. Even though they were nervous, they kept reminding themselves that no one had ever been harmed by answering a distress call. That thought gave them courage, even if it was a fragile kind dot. As their ship entered the region where the signal originated, small problems began. First, one of their long-range scanners flickered off. Then, a navigation panel restarted on its own. The engine readings became unstable for a few seconds. None of this should have happened. Not in deep space, not in a quiet zone with no active stars or gravitational anomalies. The crew exchanged nervous looks. They had traveled through ion storms and asteroid belts before without issues, yet here, in empty space, their systems were acting strange. The captain asked the engineers to run checks, but the results came back normal. Nothing was technically wrong, yet the glitches continued. That was when someone noticed that every malfunction happened exactly when the odd part of the signal pulsed. It was as if the mysterious frequency was touching their ship, pushing against their systems like a heartbeat they couldn't see. Whispers started among the younger crew members. They had grown up hearing tales about beings that lived outside mapped space, creatures that didn't follow the rules of physics, that shaped machines and minds alike simply by being nearby. Their elders always said those stories were exaggerations or old myths meant to keep children close to home. But the signal felt too intense to ignore. Stories they once laughed at suddenly didn't seem so unrealistic. Despite their fear, the captain insisted they move forward. If someone had sent out a distress call, there was a chance lives were at risk. Turning back without at least taking a look felt wrong. The crew trusted their captain, so they steadied themselves and continued. Hours later, the distant shape of a small moon appeared on their screens. It was an unremarkable gray sphere circling a dying planet. But the distress signal came from a structure orbiting above the moon, an abandoned mining colony that no one had used in years. As their ship approached, the crew grew silent. The station was completely dark. Not a single light, not a single sign of movement. Most abandoned structures drift aimlessly after years without maintenance. But this one was perfectly positioned, as if someone had corrected its orbit not long ago. That alone made the crew uneasy. Something had touched this station recently. When they docked and stepped inside, the air felt different. Not dirty, not damaged, just heavy, like the space had not been disturbed for a long time. Tools lay scattered as if workers had dropped them mid-task. A chair was overturned near a console. A lunch container rested on a table, still sealed, untouched. It looked like everyone had simply vanished in an instant. They walked through the silent halls cautiously, trying not to let their imagination take control. Every species that traveled through space had seen abandoned stations before, but this one had a strange mood. Almost every door had scratch marks near the frame, not deep, but enough to show something had tugged at them. Some console screens were cracked. A few corridors were sealed by emergency locks from the inside. The deeper they moved, the more signs of panic they found. A communication room had its wires ripped out. A storage area was left open with supplies scattered across the floor. It was clear something frightened the workers enough to make them flee without finishing anything they were doing. One of the crew members replayed old security footage they recovered from a half-broken terminal. The video was grainy and silent, but they could see workers pointing frantically toward a window. When the camera shifted, something huge passed over the colony, something large, enough to cast a shadow across the whole frame. The recording ended abruptly, leaving their imaginations to fill in the rest. The crew returned to their ship to analyze all the data they gathered. They replayed the signal again and again, trying to understand what the second frequency meant. It wasn't simply noise. It had structure. It had rhythm. It almost sounded like breathing. A heavy, slow-breathing pattern that did not belong to machines. One of the science officers compared it with old data archives, and that was when the atmosphere inside the ship shifted completely. The mysterious frequency matched fragments of signals found in ancient records that described encounters with a type of being that most species considered a myth. These stories called them Dreadworlders, travelers shaped by worlds, so harsh that their bodies and instincts were unlike anything else in the galaxy. Most people believed the Dreadworlders were only legends, stories told around lamps and campfires on quiet nights, tales meant to entertain young explorers. But now, with the old frequency echoing through the ship, no one felt like Laughing Dot if the stories were true, and Dreadworlders were not invaders or monsters. They were survivors from planets that no one else dared to approach. Worlds with storms stronger than steel, predators faster than machines, and climates that changed from fire to ice within hours. Anyone raised in such an environment would naturally seem powerful and unpredictable to species that grew up in calm, gentle worlds. The crew felt torn. Part of them wondered if they should leave before they attracted attention from whatever sent the secondary signal. But another part felt drawn to the truth. If Dreadworlders were real, then perhaps they weren't dangerous. They were simply misunderstood. The captain gathered everyone and spoke calmly. They came here to offer help. They would not run based on fear alone. The station still held traces of life, and someone might still be out there. The crew agreed, though their hearts felt heavy with doubt as their ship prepared to continue searching the moon's orbit. The signal suddenly shifted. The distress call faded away, replaced by a steady pulse that grew brighter on their screens. Something was moving toward them. Something enormous. Something not listed on any chart. The crew held their breath as the shape slowly appeared from the shadows of the moon, its sleek metal surface reflecting the faint starlight. It wasn't like any ship they had ever seen. It looked both ancient and advanced, built for survival rather than beauty. The crew expected fear to rise in their chests, but instead, a strange calm washed over them. The unknown ship didn't charge or threaten. It simply drifted closer, as if curious. As if answering the same call the research crew followed. And in that silent moment, the crew realized they were not alone. Whatever had come, whoever it was, they had arrived with purpose. The legends might be true after all, but the truth behind them was still a mystery. The crew waited, frozen between fear and wonder, as the mysterious ship stopped only a short distance away, and the first communication signal began to form. The mysterious ship finally stopped moving, and for a long moment nothing happened. On the research vessel, the crew waited in total silence, listening to the soft hum of their own engines. Everyone kept thinking the same thing, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Whatever had arrived was far bigger and far more advanced than their own vessel. It could easily overpower them if it wanted to. Yet instead of taking any aggressive action, it simply hovered there, quiet and still, like someone waiting politely at a door. The captain glanced at the communication console, hoping the unknown ship would try to send a message. But all the screens remained blank. The only signal came from the old distress frequency that first guided them here. Now that they were facing another ship, it became clear the new vessel wasn't the source of that cry for help. If anything, it seemed like this ship had followed the same call they had. That thought eased the tension just a little. If both ships were here for the same reason, then perhaps this wasn't a threat at all. Maybe it was a rescue. But the crew still couldn't relax completely. The legends about Dreadworlders were faint but unforgettable, and the design of the ship in front of them matched those stories too closely to ignore. The hull was shaped like a thick crescent, almost like something built to survive pressure far greater than normal space. The edges were marked with scratches and dents that looked old, as if the ship had traveled through places no ordinary vessel could survive. On one side, a long glowing strip pulsed slowly, like the heartbeat of a living creature. Each pulse seemed to ripple through the surrounding space, disturbing the ion field around it. Every detail added to the feeling that the ship didn't just travel through the galaxy, it endured it. The captain finally took a quiet breath and gave the order to send a greeting. A simple message, gentle and respectful, letting whoever was aboard know that they came in peace and were here because of the distress call. The message left their ship and crossed the silent void between them. For several seconds, there was no response. Then, slowly, a soft flicker appeared on their communication screen. It wasn't a full transmission, just a short signal letting them know their message had been received. Someone on the crew whispered that this was a good sign. Someone else whispered that it meant the legends really were true. But the captain stayed focused. They didn't know who was on the other side, but they needed to understand what was happening on the mining colony. Whatever scared the workers away must still be somewhere docked to gather more clues. The crew prepared to re-enter the abandoned station. They didn't want the other ship to misunderstand their movements, so they sent another short message explaining their intention. Again, a tiny flicker appeared on the screen. It felt like permission, or at least acknowledgement. The research team stepped back onto the station, this time exploring deeper into the old mining facility. The air felt colder, though their suits showed normal levels. It was the kind of chill that came from emptiness, from places where life had been suddenly cut short. The crew spread out slowly, making sure they could still see each other. They didn't want anyone wandering off alone. The first part of the station had been strange, but the second half was worse. As they moved down a central corridor, they noticed the same burn marks on the floor they had seen earlier, but now they found longer trails, as if something had slid or been dragged across the metal. At one point, a small pile of tools lay next to the wall. A heavy mechanical cutter lay broken in half. It wasn't snapped. It looked melted, like something extremely hot had passed over it for a brief moment. This confused the engineers. Nothing in the station could produce that kind of heat. Mining equipment had safeguards to prevent extreme temperatures, especially in enclosed areas where overheating could cause pressure buildups. Whatever melted that tool didn't belong here. The crew continued forward until they reached the large central chamber where workers would meet during their breaks. The moment they stepped inside, something felt wrong. The room should have been a place of noise and movement during normal operations, but now it was eerily perfect in its stillness. Benches were in place, tables were clean, and a holoscreen in the far corner flickered faintly with an old paused broadcast. But the part that bothered them the most was the faint imprint on the floor, several overlapping tracks. almost like footprints, but larger and spaced farther apart than any known worker species. The prints were not clear enough to identify, but the size alone was enough to unsettle them. They approached the holoscreen and replayed the last recorded broadcast. It was a news update about a faraway star cluster, completely ordinary. But someone had paused it in a hurry, judging by the blurred motion before the freeze frame. No one would pause a boring broadcast so suddenly unless something urgent had happened. Few crew members searched the station logs. They found that the last entry was incomplete. Only 2 words appeared before the text cut off. "It's here." The entire team paused when they saw that. They knew this wasn't a malfunction. Someone had started to type that message in panic. Whatever they meant never got the chance to be finished. The captain's voice sounded softer than usual as they ordered everyone to return to the ship. Not because they believed something dangerous would appear, but because they realized the second unknown frequency in the distress signal might not be from the workers at all. It could be from whatever frightened them not. As the crew walked back through the corridors, each step felt heavier. They kept replaying the short video they found earlier in their minds, the shadow crossing the colony windows. They still didn't know what cast that shadow, but whatever it was, it must have been huge. Once everyone reached the safety of their own vessel, they quickly shared their findings with the officers. They also updated the unknown ship, sending a summary of the imprints, the melted tool, and the final log message. After a few moments, the unknown vessel finally sent its first full reply. It wasn't a message of words, but a soft sequence of tones that sounded structured, purposeful, and oddly familiar. The crew played the sequence again and again, until one of the analysts recognized the pattern. It matched the old breathing-like frequency hidden inside the distress signal. The mysterious ship was telling them that it recognized the threat as well. That raised a new question. If this ship knew about the threat, then who exactly was inside? Were they survivors? Explorers? Witnesses? Or were they simply responding to the same danger that chased away the workers? The research team stared at the unknown ship through the large viewing window. The longer they looked, the more they noticed small details. There were reinforced plates welded along the sides, not part of the original design, added with rough precision, as if patched during emergencies. There were tiny symbols etched near the front, faded but still visible. They looked like marks, made by people who had lived through too many difficult journeys. Then someone on the crew pointed out a faint glow, coming from one of the escape pod ports on the unknown vessel. It wasn't the glow of malfunctioning equipment. It was the glow of life support systems, meaning someone inside the vessel was preparing something. Not weapons, not shields, something else. Moments later, a small shuttle separated from the unknown ship. It drifted slowly, almost cautiously, toward the abandoned station. The research crew watched carefully. The shuttle didn't activate any aggressive systems. Its path was steady, almost respectful, as if the people inside knew. The station was a place touched by fear. Everyone on the research crew gathered near the observation window, mesmerized by the scene. For the first time, they wondered if the legends had been wrong. Maybe Dreadworlders weren't terrifying beings wandering through the galaxy. Maybe they were explorers driven by the same instinct as themselves, to help those in danger. The small shuttle reached the station's docking port and attached smoothly. The crew waited for a sign of what would happen next. And then they saw it. A figure stepped out into the dim corridor of the abandoned colony. The silhouette was tall and strong, shaped by a life spent in places where survival was never guaranteed. The posture wasn't hostile, in fact. It looked strangely calm, like someone used to dealing with danger without losing their focus. The research team couldn't see the figure clearly yet, but one thing became obvious. whoever had arrived was familiar with fear, familiar with harsh environments, and familiar with answering distress calls others were too scared to approach. The crew exchanged uncertain glances. The legends had described beings like this travelers, born on dangerous worlds with instincts sharper than any normal explorer. Worlds where storms, fire, cold, and predators constantly shaped those who lived there. Worlds called death worlds by most species. But those legends never mentioned one important thing, that Dreadworlders might appear not as conquerors, but as responders to a cry for help. And now, someone from that mysterious ship was standing inside the abandoned mining colony, carrying a quiet strength that felt both intimidating and reassuring. Whatever the truth was, it would reveal itself very soon. The figure moved deeper into the station, and for the first time since arriving, the research crew felt a sense of hope mixed with the growing realization that their understanding of the galaxy was about to change forever. The small shuttle from the unknown ship stayed attached to the abandoned station for a long moment, its lights glowing softly in the dark corridor. Inside the research vessel, everyone remained frozen near the observation window, watching the faint silhouette moving inside the old mining structure. The figure walked with quiet confidence, every step steady, as if they were used to exploring dangerous or unfamiliar places. No one on the research crew spoke. They didn't know whether they should feel relieved or worried. The legends about Dreadworlders stayed in the back of their minds like a soft echo. But the figure didn't act like a monster from an old story. They walked with purpose, but not aggression. They seemed more like someone who had seen fear many times and learned to move through it without being overwhelmed. The crew kept observing until the figure reached one of the damaged hallways. When they stopped, it was clear they were examining the melted tool left behind by the workers. The figure crouched down, touched the edge gently, and looked around as if trying to understand what caused it. Their movements were calm, careful, almost respectful. Anyone watching closely could tell they were experienced, someone trained to gather information. Quietly, rather than panic. Back on the research vessel, one of the analysts finally whispered that the figure's way of exploring reminded them of rescue teams who enter dangerous zones after a disaster. That made everyone pause. The idea was surprisingly comforting. The unknown ship had responded to the distress call too, just like they had. So maybe the figure inside the station wasn't a threat. They were another responder, someone trying to help. The captain sent a short signal to the unknown ship, just a polite request, asking if they needed assistance or wanted to share information. A moment later, a soft tone replied. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't demanding. It sounded like acknowledgement. The crew didn't know what language it came from, but the tone felt neutral, even calm. Inside the station, the figure continued moving. They passed through the central chamber where the large footprint-like tracks were left on the floor. They knelt beside the marks and traced the edges with their gloved hand, studying them with deep focus. Then they stood, turned toward the broken communication console, and gently tapped the burnt panel. At that moment, something clicked softly through the research crew's audio feed. Not a full message, just a faint sound, almost like breathing. It wasn't from the research ship. It wasn't from the station. It came from the unknown visitor's suit. Someone on the research team leaned forward, trying to make sense of it. The sound wasn't unsettling. In fact, it almost sounded like the visitor was talking to themselves, quietly checking something or calming themselves in a stressful environment. It was a very human thing to do, something people did when they didn't want fear to take over. The thought hit the crew all at once. The visitor wasn't some creature from a frightening legend. They weren't a mythical being shaped by dark mysteries. They were a person, someone who breathed, who thought, who reacted like anyone else would when faced with danger. Whether They were the Dreadworlders from Old Stories or Not. They were alive, aware, and clearly intelligent. The visitor eventually reached the area where the old video recording had shown a large shadow passing over the colony. They lifted a device from their belt, scanned the walls, and then slowly looked upward. The research crew couldn't see what they saw inside the station, but the way the figure's posture changed made something clear. They recognized the signs. Whatever scared the workers was something they had seen before. The captain, watching every movement with steady eyes, knew they needed to open communication properly. This silent exchange could only last so long. They sent a simple broadcast directly toward the unknown ship, not words, but a brief signal containing their intention. They were willing to talk peacefully. This time the response didn't come from the unknown ship. It came from inside the station. The visitor paused, lifted a small device from their wrist, tapped it softly, and sent a short message back. It wasn't a full language or a sentence. Just a few tones, simple and clear. But the meaning behind the tones was easy to understand. It was permission. Next. The visitor stepped toward a console, wiped the dust from its cracked surface, and connected a small device. A low humming sound filled the corridor as the console lit up faintly for the first time in months. The visitor pressed a few buttons, and a glowing data panel appeared above their wrist. The research crew suddenly realized the visitor was downloading the colony's logs. That meant they either wanted to know what happened or already had an idea and needed confirmation. The captain decided it was time to take a step forward. They activated a small drone inside their ship and sent it quietly across the docking bridge toward the abandoned station. The drone didn't approach the visitor directly. It hovered near the entrance, just close enough to be noticed, but not close enough to be threatening. Inside the corridor, the visitor turned slowly, staring at the drone. They didn't lift a weapon. They didn't show any signs of hostility. They simply watched, completely calm, as if evaluating whether the drone was safe. After a few seconds, they gave a small nod, not a dramatic one, not a gesture meant to communicate excitement or surprise. Just a simple nod that felt very real, very grounded, very human. The drone projected a tiny display with a short message. "We are here to help." For a moment, the visitor remained still. The only movement was the faint rise and fall of their breathing. Then they tapped their wrist device again, and a short line of sound played through the drone's audio receiver. It wasn't any known language, but the tone of the message had no sharpness, no warning. It sounded cooperative. The crew took that as a sign to continue. The drone projected a second message. What happened to the workers? This time the visitor responded more quickly. They pointed at the floor where the strange marks were, then pointed toward the ceiling vents, then toward the deeper halls. The gestures were simple but meaningful. Something moved through the station, something the workers couldn't control. The research crew felt a cold wave move through the ship. They had suspected something had forced the workers to flee, but seeing the visitor confirm it through simple gestures made the situation feel more real. The visitor then walked deeper into the station, motioning for the drone to follow. The research crew watched through its small camera. The narrow hallway ahead was dim and full of shadows. The visitor never hesitated, not even once. They moved like someone who had spent years walking through dark, unstable places. Eventually, they reached a set of large metal doors sealed by emergency locks. The drone hovered closer, capturing every detail. The visitor placed a hand on the cold surface of the door, then turned slightly toward the drone, as if saying, "This is where it happened." The research crew's analysts examined the footage. The doors weren't damaged. They had been sealed intentionally. That meant the workers weren't running from something they saw outside. They were trying to trap something inside. The visitor reached toward the locking panel and activated a scanner, After a few seconds, a faint sound echoed through the hall, like something shifting behind the door. The visitor froze, not out of fear but awareness. The drone's sensors picked up a soft vibration coming from the other side. Something was alive in there. Something trapped. The research crew's hearts raced. They didn't want anyone, not even the visitor, to open that door. They sent a quick signal through the drone saying, "Stop, it is dangerous." The visitor looked straight at the drone, pressed their wrist device, and sent a single reply tone. It was a sound that carried no urgency, no fear, just steady confidence. A tone that said, "I know." Then they stepped back from the door. They weren't going to open it. They had only wanted to confirm what was inside. Before leaving, the visitor placed a small marker beside the sealed doors, almost like leaving a warning sign for anyone who might come later. Then they motioned for the drone to follow again as they headed back toward the central chamber. The research crew began breathing again, though no one had realized how tense they were until that moment, when the visitor reached the main entrance. Of the station, they stepped directly in front of the drone. They raised one hand slowly, palm open, a universal gesture used across hundreds of species. The drone scanned the gesture, and a moment later, the research crew understood the meaning. The visitor was asking to communicate properly. The second, they signaled their willingness. The unknown ship outside began preparing its main communication channel. Lights flickered softly along its hull, and the glow from the long strip pulsed faster, like a heartbeat picking up pace. The visitor walked. Into their shuttle, the doors closed, and the small craft undocked from the station. It drifted smoothly back toward the unknown vessel, and the research crew could feel it in their bones. Something important was about to happen. They were finally going to meet whoever had come from that powerful ship. The legends called them Dreadworlders, but the crew was starting to understand that those legends might have left out the most important truth. These beings weren't feared because they were destructive. They were feared because they walked into danger others ran from. And now they were coming to talk. The research crew prepared themselves, their hearts racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Whatever they learned next would change everything. They thought they knew about the galaxy. For the next few days, life moved in a strange, quiet rhythm. Every morning, I woke up earlier than usual, as if something inside me refused to let me rest. I wasn't scared anymore, but I wasn't completely relaxed either. It felt like my mind was still trying to understand what had happened at the old building and why everything felt so different afterward. Even simple things like the sound of a door closing or the movement of shadows on the wall felt sharper than before. I noticed details I never paid attention to. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. One evening, I sat outside in the small open area near my house. The weather was calm, and the sky had a soft orange glow as the sun went down. I remember thinking that the world looked normal, peaceful, but inside me things were changing. I kept thinking about the old man I had met earlier, how he seemed to understand things without needing many words. I wasn't sure if he was really trying to guide me, or if he was just someone who appeared at the right moment and said the right things. But his words stayed in my mind like a quiet echo. While I was sitting there, my cousin walked by and asked why I looked so lost in thought. I told him I was just tired, and he laughed, saying I always looked tired. He didn't know anything about the strange night I had been through, and I didn't want to tell him. Not because I was hiding something, but because I didn't have the right words to explain it. If I tried, it would sound confusing, maybe even unbelievable. So I decided to keep it to myself. Some things are easier that way. That night, I tried to sleep early, but my mind wouldn't slow down. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the sound of footsteps in the empty building, the dim light, the feeling of something invisible watching me, and then the relief when everything finally ended. It was like watching a story from far away, except I was the main part of it. I turned to the other side, pulled the blanket over myself, and told my mind to stop replaying everything. But instead of fear, I felt curiosity. Why did it happen? Why me? And why did I get out safely? These questions pushed me deeper into my thoughts until I finally fell asleep. The next morning, something unusual happened. I woke up before the alarm again, and for the first time in weeks, I felt strangely calm. There was no heavy feeling in my chest, no sudden jump of panic, just quiet. I stood by the window and watched the sunrise. The way the light slowly filled the room made me feel grounded, like I was returning to myself. I didn't know if this peace would last, but at that moment, I accepted it. Later that day, I had to go to the market to get some things for the house. Normally, I walked there without thinking much, but this time I paid attention to everything around me. I noticed the shopkeepers arranging items on their counters, kids running after each other, people bargaining loudly, and the smell of spices coming from a nearby stall. It felt like the world was louder, alive in a way I had forgotten. Even the smallest things had a certain weight to them. On my way back, I saw the same old man again, the one who had spoken to me the night before the strange incident. He was sitting on a bench near the road, drinking tea from a small cup. When he saw me, he smiled, not surprised at all, as if he had been expecting me to pass by. I hesitated for a moment, but then walked toward him. He asked how I was feeling, and I said better. He nodded like he already knew that would be my answer. I didn't ask him any questions. Something about him made me feel that even if I did, he wouldn't explain things the way I expected. He finished his tea slowly and said one simple sentence. When something unusual happens, it is not always a warning. Sometimes it's a lesson. I wanted to ask what lesson he meant, but before I could, someone came up to him asking for directions. When I looked back, he had stood up and started walking away. He didn't say goodbye, and somehow that felt normal for him. I watched him disappear into the crowd, and for a small moment, it felt like I had seen a chapter of a book close in. Front of me. Over the next few days, life returned to a routine. I focused on work, handled things at home, and tried to stay busy. But there was a quiet shift inside me. I wasn't the same person who had entered that old building. I felt more patient, more aware of myself, and strangely more grateful for simple things like being able to walk outside without worry, having a normal day, eating dinner with family, or hearing laughter from the neighbors' kids. These things had always been there, but I had never really noticed how important they were. One afternoon, a friend called me, asking if I wanted to meet up at the park. I almost said no because I wasn't in the mood for loud conversations, but then I decided to go anyway. When I reached the park, he started talking excitedly about some plan he had for the weekend. I listened, and for the first time, I found myself smiling naturally. Being around people felt good again, like I had rejoined the world after being away for a long time. As we walked around, he talked about random things, work, old memories, jokes, even small frustrations. In the middle of our conversation, he paused and looked at me closely. He said, "You look different." Not in a bad way, just calmer. I laughed, trying to brush it off, but inside, I felt something warm. I hadn't realized the change was visible. To others, I just told him I had been trying to take life less seriously. He nodded like he understood, though he had no idea what that really meant. Later that evening, while returning home, I took the longer road on purpose. It gave me a few extra minutes to think. I realized that sometimes life shakes us not to break, use, but to wake us. The strange experience at the old building had scared me at first, but it also forced me to see life differently. It made me notice things I had ignored for years. It made me reflect. It made me grow. I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't trying to solve everything anymore. Instead, I accepted that some things happen for reasons we may never fully understand. Maybe the purpose is not to understand, but to learn something about ourselves from those moments. When I reached home, I sat quietly for a few minutes before going inside. The sky was turning dark again, and the first star of the night had appeared. I looked at it and felt a sense of peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because I felt stronger inside. In the following days, this calmness stayed with me. I still had responsibilities, work, stress, and normal life problems, but I handled them differently, with more patience and less fear. I talked less, but listened more. I judged less and understood more. Even small arguments didn't bother me the way they used to. A few days later, something unexpected happened. My younger brother told me he had been feeling stressed about his studies, and he didn't know how to deal with it. Normally, I would have given him short, simple advice and walked away. But this time, I sat with him, listened properly, and helped him figure things out, step by step. He looked relieved afterward, and that made me feel surprisingly good. Maybe this new calmness wasn't just helping me, it was helping others too. One night, as I lay in bed thinking about everything, I realized that the strange incident at the old building no longer scared me. Instead, it felt like a turning point, a moment that forced me to confront myself, face my fear, and come out stronger. I didn't need to talk about it, and I didn't need anyone to understand it. It was mine, a part of my journey. And even though life would keep moving forward with new twists and challenges, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't the same person I used to be. Something inside me had changed quietly but deeply. And somehow, I was grateful for that. Days kept passing, and slowly everything around me started to feel normal again. But inside, a quiet shift continued. It wasn't something I could explain easily, not even to myself. It was like a small light had turned on inside my mind, soft, steady, and impossible to ignore. I felt calmer, but also more aware of things I had overlooked for years. Even small moments felt meaningful, in a way they never did before. One morning, I woke up with a strange feeling, not of fear, but of curiosity. I kept thinking about the old building and how everything started. It wasn't because I wanted to go back or relive anything. It was more like my mind wanted to understand why that moment had changed me so much. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, watching the sunlight enter the room through the curtains. Life looked simple from where I sat, but my thoughts felt deep. I went to the kitchen and made tea. As I sat sipping it, I noticed the small details, the aroma rising from the cup, the quiet crackling sound of the stove cooling down, the rhythm of life inside my home. These were things I usually ignored, but now they felt grounding, like they kept me connected to the present. Maybe that's what the old experience taught me, to appreciate the moments that seemed too ordinary before. Later that day, I had to run some errands. On my way out, I met an old neighbor who stopped me to ask how everything was going. Normally, I would answer quickly and walk away, but this time I stood there, listening to him talk about his daily routine, his small problems, and his hopeful plans for the coming weeks. I didn't mind the conversation. In fact, I found it peaceful. Sometimes the simple thoughts of others remind us that everyone carries something. We're all trying to move forward in our own way. After finishing my errands, I decided to take a longer route home. There was a small path behind the main road that led through an open field. People rarely used it, but I always found it calming. As I walked, I felt the cool breeze brushing against my face. The sky was wide and clear, and the soft sound of leaves moving in the wind made the moment feel almost timeless. I kept thinking about how life sometimes teaches us lessons through moments we don't expect. The things we fear can shape us in ways we don't realize until later. When I reached home, my mother asked me why I looked lost in thought. I smiled and said I was just tired. She didn't ask more, and I appreciated that. Some feelings are better kept inside until they settle. I helped her with a few chores around the house, and then spent the rest of the evening watching TV with my family. It felt comforting to sit with them, laugh at small jokes, and simply be present. I hadn't felt this connected in a long time. That night, after everyone went to sleep, I stayed awake for a while. I opened the window and looked outside. The street was quiet, only a few dim lights glowing here and there. I could hear the soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional sound of a dog barking somewhere far away. And in that silence, I felt peaceful. It was the kind of peace that doesn't come from the world around you, but from inside. For some reason, I remembered the old man again, the one who always spoke in simple sentences that somehow carried deep meaning. I wondered who he really was. Why did he appear at the right moments? Was he just an ordinary person, or was his presence meant to guide me during that phase of my life? I didn't know, and maybe I didn't need to know. Some people enter our lives quietly, leave a lesson behind, and move on without explanation. The next morning, I decided to do something different. Instead of spending the day inside, I packed a small bag and walked to a nearby lake. It wasn't very far, but I rarely visited it. The place was peaceful, with a few benches around and tall trees casting shadows on the water. I sat under one of those trees and watched the calm surface of the lake. Every now and then, a fish would jump, breaking the water for a split second before everything returned to silence. Sitting there made me realize something important. In life, we often wait for big moments to change us, but sometimes it's the quiet moments, the ones no one else sees, that shape us the most. The strange night at the old building had shaken me, but it also opened a door in my mind. Now, moments like this by the lake felt special, like tiny reminders that life is always offering us chances to reflect, breathe, and grow. After spending nearly an hour there, I stood up to leave. As I walked away, a gentle thought crossed my mind. Maybe healing doesn't happen all at once. Maybe it happens slowly, through small choices, choosing peace over panic, choosing patience over frustration, choosing awareness over rushing through life. In the following days, I found myself becoming more helpful around the house. I noticed when someone seemed upset, and I tried to comfort them in simple ways. Not with big speeches, but with small gestures, listening properly, offering help, or just being present. I realized that being there for others didn't require special skills. It only needed a sincere heart and a calm mind. One evening, my friend came to visit. He sat down and told me he had been feeling stressed. His job wasn't going the way he expected, and he didn't know what to do. He kept talking for almost half an hour while I listened quietly. At one point, he looked at me and said he didn't know why he was telling me all this, but he felt lighter just speaking about it. That made me smile. Sometimes, people just need someone who won't judge them or interrupt them. I didn't give him heavy advice. I kept it simple. I told him that every person goes through difficult phases, and that what he was feeling wasn't a failure. It was part of life's process. He nodded, and for the first time that evening, he looked calmer. Before leaving, he said, "You've changed in a good way." I didn't know what to say, so I just laughed softly. But his words stayed with me long after he left. As days went by, I noticed my perspective on life changing little by little. I wasn't running from my thoughts anymore. I wasn't avoiding quiet moments. Instead, I embraced them. Sometimes I sat alone for a few minutes, letting my mind settle. Other times, I enjoyed simple things like a cup of tea, a peaceful walk, or a conversation with someone close. But one day, something unexpected happened that made all these changes feel even more meaningful. I received a message from someone who lived near the old building. He told me that the place had been fully sealed off by authorities. I didn't ask why. Maybe it was old, unsafe, or simply time for it to be removed. But when I heard the news, a strange feeling rose in me. It wasn't fear not anymore. It was closure. That building had played a strange role in my life, a chapter filled with confusion and fear, but also growth and self-awareness. Hearing that it was no longer accessible felt like the universe telling me, that part of your journey is over. You can move on now. That night I slept peacefully. No replaying memories, no sudden fear, no tension. Just quiet sleep. The next morning, as I walked outside, I realized I was smiling for no reason. Life felt lighter, like a heavy load had been quietly taken off my shoulders without me noticing. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, and felt grateful for the lessons, the growth, the peace, and even for the difficult moments that had shaped me. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But for the first time in a long while, I felt ready for whatever came next. I felt stronger, calmer, and more connected to myself. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter. The days after the news about the old building felt strangely peaceful. It was almost like someone had gently closed a door behind me, leaving me free to walk forward without constantly looking back. Even though nothing dramatic changed on the outside, something inside me felt different, lighter, calmer, more open to life. I started noticing things around me more clearly, as if the world had become sharper and softer at the same time. One quiet morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sky outside was still dim, holding the last shade of night. I sat by the window and watched as the first light slowly spread across the rooftops. For years, mornings like this never meant anything to me. They were just transitions between sleep and routine. But this morning felt special. The air looked clean, and the world felt calm, as if it was gently reminding me that every day begins with a chance to start fresh. After sitting for a while, I got up and prepared tea. Usually, I drank it quickly and rushed into the day, but this time I took it outside and sat on the small step near the doorway. The street was silent, except for a few birds calling from somewhere far away. I let the warm cup rest in my hands and simply breathed. It felt good to do nothing, to just exist in the moment without pressure or noise. Later that day, as I walked to the market, I noticed a small group of children playing near the roadside. They were trying to build something from sticks and stones, laughing even when the whole thing kept falling apart. I stood for a moment and watched them. Their joy was pure and simple. They didn't care about perfection. They cared about the moment. And somewhere in that small scene, I felt a lesson hiding, one that life had been trying to teach me for months. Not everything has to be perfect. Sometimes the process matters more than the result. When I reached the market, I greeted a few familiar faces. People who had seen me countless times but never truly noticed me, and whom I had never taken the time to really look at either. But today, I observed the details: the tired shopkeeper arranging fruits with quiet dedication, the old vendor slowly counting coins with steady hands, the woman choosing vegetables while humming softly to herself. Each person looked busy, yet each one carried their own story, their own struggles, their own hopes. It made me realize how connected we all are, even when we don't say it. On my way back home, I passed by a bench under a large tree. A man sat there reading a newspaper, his posture relaxed, his face peaceful. I had seen him many times before, but never gave him a second thought. But today, watching him sitting there calmly made me feel something warm, like an understanding. Everyone searches for their own sense of peace. Some find it in conversations, some in silence, some in books, some in memories. I realized that the peace I was slowly discovering had always been available. I just never paused long enough to feel it. Sometimes life changes not because something big happens, but because we finally start seeing the small things. A few evenings later, I received a call from a friend who lived across the city. He hadn't visited in months. His voice sounded excited, and he told me he was planning a small gathering and wanted me to come. A few months ago, I would have found an excuse to avoid it. Social gatherings made me uneasy, especially when my thoughts were unsettled. But this time, without even thinking too much, I said yes. The next day, I prepared myself and left early. The ride across the city felt refreshing. The streets, the buildings, the people walking by, everything felt alive in a way I hadn't noticed in a long time. When I reached my friend's place, he welcomed me warmly. There were a few others there, chatting casually. At first, I felt a bit nervous, but slowly, as conversations flowed, the tension faded. We talked about ordinary things, work, weather, funny memories, future plans. Nothing dramatic or deep, yet somehow meaningful. One of the guests talked about how he had recently started learning gardening and how it brought him peace. Another person shared how she had finally decided to pursue something she loved after years of hesitation. Listening to them made me realize how everyone is on their own journey, finding their way through life step by step. At one point during the gathering, my friend pulled me aside and asked if everything had been okay recently. I told him yes, and for the first time in a long while, I meant it. He smiled and said he could see the difference in me. I didn't say much, but inside, I felt grateful. Sometimes it takes another person's eyes to remind us how far we have come. When I returned home later that night, the air felt cooler, carrying a soft breeze. I walked slowly, appreciating the peaceful silence of the neighborhood. As I reached the front door, I paused and looked at the sky. It was filled with stars, each one glowing quietly. They looked distant but comforting, like reminders that even in the vastness of the universe, every shining point had its own purpose. Days turned into weeks, and life settled into a gentle rhythm. The thoughts that once overwhelmed me no longer held the same power. Instead, new thoughts, calmer, softer, more hopeful, started growing. I found myself helping around the house more, engaging in small conversations with family, and even enjoying simple tasks like cleaning, organizing, or cooking. They felt grounding, like anchors that kept me steady. One afternoon, my mother told me she noticed how much calmer I had become. She didn't ask what made the change. She simply said she was happy to see me at peace.